Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Stedman podcast. I hope you are all having a wonderful day. Life has been busy, so I do apologize for not having a podcast last week because it was just wild. But we are here, and joining me is Micah Current. And Micah, how are you doing today?
Just to be clear, you had one, you just didn't post it.
Yes, I have one. I just didn't post it. So whenever you listen to this, you're going to be like, "Oh, there's that blip in the schedule." That's the reason why. Just a lot going on.
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. There's just been a lot of stuff going on, not only personally, and church wise, but even just the thing about Christianity and religion in general. Um, yeah, like actually, we got a comment about our the episode we did where he talked about should churches disclose their finances. I've had a couple comments on it.
Yeah.
I had one comment from Alicia, actually from because I occasionally I post stuff on LinkedIn. Not really sure if anyone watches it, but someone from LinkedIn commented and goes, "I would be very skeptical if I went to a church and they didn't disclose their financial information." And then I had another person go, "Why is this even a topic?" And I think kind of the hunch is don't all churches
Do
uh,
that.
make send out stuff out? And I think not all of them do, or at least if they do, they're not very clear as far as letting people know, hey, here's where you can get the budget. Here's where you get the church finances. Here's how you can kind of see how we're doing. Like, depending on the church you go to, um, you may or may not have it. And I think in that aspect, you just are not able to, so I think that's why it's still a topic because there are, but I would say, I don't know, Micah, I would say like the majority of churches that I have attended or the churches that I have pastored, we've always shown budget and we've always made sure we share with the congregation how we're doing financially or whatnot. But there's definitely been a few churches where I've been a member of, and I have not seen one information or talking about financials or where to see the budget or how I can even see how we're doing. Like nothing, no communication, no information at all about it. So I think it is. So I think, it may not be like the most earth shattering topic in the world, but I think it has to get people to think that, hey, if my church isn't devolving that information, then what do I do or how do I get that information? If they won't give me it, then how do I know that my financials, my tithe that I'm giving to churches is actually being used for kingdom purposes?
Advancement. Yeah.
Yeah. Um,
I think it's a great question. And, I know we talked about that and unpacked that in that episode, but it's like, I think people do have a right to be a little bit skeptical because especially if they're the church, I'm not saying any church in particular, but a church is being not very transparent in regards to their expenses. And um but I've been in churches where I know where every single penny's going.
mm,
But you know, I often wonder too if people saw church finances and saw how much pastors made for a salary, they would either be appalled for the right reasons or the wrong reasons. The right reasons being they get paid and compensated well for what they do, or it's the bad reasons they get paid too much and they probably shouldn't be, especially when there's needs otherwise in the budget. And I think that's where people get kind of frustrated because it's like, okay, you say we're good financially, but you know, we're struggling to make the budget every year. And if 75% of that's going to your pastor's salary, then that's a little concerning. Um,
mhm.
but anyway,
Yeah.
that's not what we're talking about today.
No. Actually, today we're talking about, things that churches say or do in practice that are not necessarily biblical. But before we dive into that, like there's just eh, Micah, I mean, we talked before the show, we were talking a little bit about some developments at the Church of God and especially Indiana Ministries, and there seems to be some tension there with stuff, and we don't really want to kind of get back into that. But my wife was having a conversation with me because I was sharing something, and actually, I think the thing I was sharing with her. was that Anderson University has their new president lined up to replace
Yeah, I
John
saw that
Pistol
on social media.
when John Pistol retires. So and they have kind of a
Mhm.
transition plan and everything else. And I was reading this. I'm like, oh, that's great. And I'm thinking, but then you know what else I was thinking? It took. I mean, when John Pistol announced his retirement, it's probably been less than a year, or maybe a year, or maybe a little bit less than a year, and already they have a successor. What is the Church of God's problem with trying to find a general director? I mean, Jim's announced his
Yeah,
retirement almost a couple years ago,
it'll be 2 years. I think 2 years in June.
2 years in June, and we still don't have. I mean, they're now. I mean, what they did a rollout a couple months ago. We can start taking nominations for people who would like to you nominate to be the director, but I just don't understand why it's taken this long. And plus, with all the
Uh,
other and plus with all the other issues with the stuff between credentialing and people feeling Indiana Ministries is overextending their power with certain taking away credentials from certain pastors. Like I mean, if we have no stability up in our national offices, what's going to help kind of bring some balance or do some checks and balances with our state offices? Whether they're doing something that's outside of what they need to do, or even if they're struggling and they need guidance, like where's the support? Where's the help?
I think whoever they do hire, whenever they hire someone, it's gonna there's gonna be a lot of work to do. Um, and just like any sort of major transition shift in a church or a business or a university or whatever, um, that leader, they may have a certain way of doing something, and what that can include the way they do leadership, the way they empower and equip their people, and they may want a group of completely different people. Um, but one of the things that I would do uh, right off the bat is if I were general director, I would have a monthly meeting with all of my state pastors, and then I would have one-on-one meetings with all of my state pastors and see what they're doing, see how they're doing, see how we can help them, see how we can equip them, and then put a plan together and work together with all of the states. Because the way that I see it, Scott, is that we have there's like this power struggle and this territorialness within the Church of God and tribalism almost, where we have district committees, we have state committees, like district leadership, state pastor, whatever, and national leadership, and none of which talk to each other, which is really, really frustrating because when you are going through a transition, maybe you're leaving one church to go to another, maybe you're thinking about making that transition, you just don't feel supported or empowered. And so it's like, well, what do I do and who do I talk to? And if you talk to your district, they're like, well, why are you talking to us? And then if you talk to your state, I've had conversations where it's like, well, that church is a bad church. You should probably go find another one. Well, can't you help me fix it or give me the proper steps and
Mm-hmm.
the ideas in order to fix that? If I've called Jim Lyon and I've talked to Jim on the phone before, he's like, man, I'm sorry you're going through that, but I can't help you. I don't have a say in the matter. And so, and I know it's a lot of it has to do with how the bylaws of the church are set up, but I would seriously take into consideration that this is me just if I were in that position, would be in constant communication with my state leadership and constantly in communication with, them as a group and constantly in communication with them as individuals in one-on-one settings to see how they're doing, what they're doing, and what we need to do to fix it and make it better for the Church of God nationally. Um, Missionaries and internationally is a whole nother conversation, but for the purposes of what we're talking about, you know, I know it makes it tough when you have what we call General Assembly, which is basically our big conference at our national conference every other year. Is it every 2 years now? Every other year?
It's every other
Um,
year. Yeah.
and then they have the regionals, the years that there's not the national, which they're spread out throughout the country. There's smaller versions of the bigger one, and basically the same thing, but in a smaller setting. But I would be more transparent and try to get more communication out to the assembly so that the assembly, being pastors and leaders and parishioners and churches all over the country, say, hey, we're not doing this, or we're doing this, or we view the, like, we'll just say LGBTQ conversation for the purposes of this illustration. But like, if the Church of God believes that marriage is between a man and a woman, and that's the biblical definition of what marriage is according to the Church of God Anderson, you send something out and you remind folks that, hey, this is what we believe and this is why we believe it. And just keep that communication open.
Yeah.
And not just have this communication every other year. Or go ahead, sorry.
No, but even with that, but even like if I'm a pastor who, at one point agreed with the theology and the structure of the Church of God, and now maybe as I'm reading the scriptures or whatever, and that's no longer the same anymore, then if it's like, well, if I don't believe that, if I believe that men can marry men and women can marry women, then there should be at least something where it's like, hey, even if you disagree with us, we have a process to try to help you move your credentials to another denomination that would fit your theology and make that a smooth process. And I think in some ways that would be, I think in some ways that's probably the more merciful and loving way to say, like, hey, you believe this?
Just take away your credentials and say that you can't do it anymore.
I can understand someone taking away my credentials if I did something like really bad, like embezzled money, had an affair.
Who was the couple that we had on a year or so ago?
We had Carson Collins and his wife.
And weren't they
Ashley.
Church of God, and they went to UMC or something?
Yeah.
But they went through some marital problems, and
they went through some marital problems, and even he went to try to go back to kind of get reinstated in the Church of God, and
they just wouldn't let him.
They just, well, I think there's just one person who just kept saying like, oh, like millions of people are burning in hell because of what you did, and he's like, and he was repentant of that, and then after he repented, got the help, and was kind of in this restoration process, the guy was still condemning him, and it's like, okay, I'm done. Like, and rightfully so. It's like, who are you to pass judgment on me when I'm already feel remorseful? I've already been asked God for forgiveness. I've gotten to help. My wife forgives me. And here I am. I still feel called to serve in ministry. And you're still basically holding up the pitchfork and poking me with it. Like, come on, man. Like, goodness. But yeah, I get that. But anyway, but again, I think there just needs to be whoever's, there just has to be a lot of things to get fixed within the Church of God and all the structure.
Do you think what I suggested there would be a good starting point?
Well, I think people need to get on the same page, and I think that's kind of the problem. The problem is there's not enough time as a general director, whether there's too much stuff that's on the general director's plate or whatnot, but there hasn't been enough time where there has to be communication between me saying, hey, I would like to meet with all the state ministers and we would like to discuss this. Or even if it's like, or maybe the topic is hey, I want to see where you are. I want to see where theology is, what challenges you have in your state. I could do that. But even with things like credentialing, me and whoever the national head of credentialing is, maybe it's like the chair, the state director, the credentialing person, we're going to have a big email blast meeting. We're going to say, hey, Zoom meeting, here's what it is. Here's what's going on. Here's kind of and then do individually. And I think that will take, it'll take longer, but at the same time, I think it's going to be good because at least it's going to get everyone on the same page so we don't get in these messes where we have people who are in leadership within the Church of God who believe things that the Church of God doesn't believe, like women in ministry, racial reconciliation, like any of the stuff that the task force was able to pull out, saying, "Hey, not everybody believes that women should be ministry, but that's kind of like one of our big things that we believe that women are called in ministry. So if we have people in our leadership who says, "Hey, you're a woman, but you can't be a pastor," then that's kind of a conflict of interest of what we believe as the Church of God.
Yeah, and I think, I don't know. It's I think a lot of it, and I had a conversation with somebody this morning, which kind of spurred this conversation that we're having, that, you know, the generations before us have not set us up for a win. And that this includes succession plans. This includes, you know, leadership plans, like I'm talking about with state, local, and national leadership, communications. And keep in mind those generations aren't great with technology, and so for us, it's like you and I can just text each other and figure out when we're going to do this podcast every week, or we jump on a Zoom and record a podcast every week. I mean, there are like countless things that people can do to improve the quality of what the Church of God looks like from an infrastructure stance, and it's just not happening. And so there's a lot of resistance, and like you said with the Carson situation just a few moments ago, like the guy was like, "There's thousands of people burning in hell for what you've done," and it's like, he's repenting to you and telling you what he's done was wrong and admitting that he was wrong. And he is coming before himself, humbling himself before brothers, quote unquote, brothers in Christ, brothers and sisters in Christ, do right by what he believes is right. And, they just laugh in his face. And so there's a lot of pushback, blowback, resistance, all of these things from the generations before us. And it just leads us to this question and this conversation that you and I've had for the past 3 years on this podcast about how can we be better? And I'm not bringing politics into this, I promise, but like, it's no different than our government. And you have these folks
Mm-hmm.
that are in office that have been in public office for 40 and 50 and 60 years and have no business being in public office when they should be in a nursing home because they can't function correctly. And it's
Yeah,
not a dog on anybody, but like, if you're to the point where you can't make those decisions and you're not cognitively functioning, like maybe it's time to hang it up.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. And so we'll just leave it at that because I mean we could be talking about that all day. But let's get kind of our topic at hand, which is
I don't know. It's kind of on a roll there.
I know, but I want to try to stop the ball before it gets too hard, and we can't stop it.
The
But
snowball.
the snowball. But today we're going to talk about the topic of things that churches say, or maybe they put in practice it, or they maybe things that churches put into practice that is not necessarily biblical. And I think a lot of times there's people who buy into what I like to call, um, I guess, like good Christian sayings, or we think they're good Christian sayings, but when you look theologically, they're kind of not great. So I mean, Micah, what kind of things have you yourself been heard in the church or something that has happened that has been in the church for years, but when you really begin to think about it, investigate it, you realize, hey, this isn't biblical.
How much time do you have?
Well,
Well, I mean, that's a great question. What were some of the things you were thinking of?
so I mean, like, when you think about like I mean, I'll just do an easy one. I think there is times where people will say things like, oh, geez, like, I think the biggest one that bothers me is when someone says that the devil made me do it,
Oh,
where
that's a good one.
you blame the devil for, and usually we hear this from leaders, church leaders, where they say, oh, the devil made me do it, and blah, blah, blah. And I kind of have an issue with that because sometimes it's like, well, I don't necessarily think it's the devil. The devil's kind of being a scapegoat for you not being able to take hold of the issue or the struggle that you're dealing with, or being able to get the help or being accountable for the thing. Like, and I guess the example, I may have shared this on the podcast before, but when I was pastoring my first church, there was a guy who was getting very frustrated with the pastor at his family's church because he didn't really prepare his sermon messages. He always would preach out of either Acts or Matthew. There was never anything outside of that. And then eventually he came clean to his congregation saying, "Hey, I want to confess something to you. The whole entire time that I should be the whole entire time that I should be working and preparing my sermon, I've just been sitting in the church office watching Star Trek: The Next Generation on Hulu." So the guy sits in his office, watches TV all day when he should be working, and then on Sunday morning he spins his finger around, points it at a Bible verse within Matthew or Acts, and then that's what he preaches on. And that's his prep for Sunday. And then he said, "Well, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. The devil made me do it." And it's like, that's not the devil. That's just pure laziness.
Yeah. So, I don't know, man. Like there's a lot of different things you could talk about, especially like with like I don't know, sacred cows within the church, like that you could just bring up a lot of different things where they're not necessarily biblical, and at the end of the day, they really shouldn't matter, right? And so, like, you know, I don't know. Think of like a really, I mean, does your church that you're at now, the UMC church, the traditional service do liturgy?
We have a liturgy. Yeah.
Okay. Do you like follow any sort of like curriculum or anything like that? Or do you just kind of pick and choose what you guys want to do as far as
It
church?
can be either or. Like, I mean, from the way, like for example, I'm preaching this Sunday, since my the lead is gone. So I asked her. I said, "Hey, is there like a special series you want to do for the month of February, or are you just kind of preaching from the lectionary?" And she goes, "Oh, well, I'm just going through the lectionary." And
Yeah.
sometimes if she doesn't like some of the stuff that's some of the things, the direction, or maybe some of the things that's happened in the lectionary, she'll go off and do her own thing. But it's almost like we can do what we want, but we do have this lectionary as a backdrop in case we get to the point where it's like, I don't really know what to preach on. So I'm actually using a lectionary, and actually the verse I'm using is Jeremiah 17:5 through 10. And so so that's basically the sermon that I'm kind of basing the message off, is based on that scripture.
You're
Um,
not doing Matthew or Acts.
nope, I'm doing Jeremiah. I'm doing an Old Testament, but then I'm
There's,
also making a connection to that to John 4.
you mean there's more than two books of the Bible?
Yes. So, um, I think sometimes, as far as I think the other big thing, and I'm probably going to get some heat for this one, is designated funds.
Yeah.
Here's the thing. I don't think it's bad for a church or somebody or a couple people from the church to basically say, "Hey, we want to raise money for this specific thing. Like, we want to have like a fund to get new chairs because our chairs are falling apart, or to recondition, to redo our pews." Like, I don't think there's anything wrong with that, or having an account where that money goes to. And then if you have anything left over, you kind of still have this designated account for any type of repairs or stuff for seating or whatever at the church. Where I kind of get where I kind of get a little like iffy about it is when people say, "Well, you can only use this money for this specific thing."
Yeah.
And basically, when you look, and again, my dad being a financial person, technically there's no law or no biblical law or anything saying that you have to use that money for repairs. Now, I think it's good practice if someone says, "Hey, I'm giving money for this project." But even if someone says, "Hey, I want to give money for this project to change the carpet, to put hot pink carpet in the sanctuary," um, I think as a board and as a pastor, you can kind of say, "Well, we do need carpet, but probably not hot pink." Or maybe, we still, I know the carpet's getting looking old, and we probably will need something down the road. But right now, the biggest need we have right now is we have a heater that's on its last legs. And if we don't get this repaired, when winter hits, it's going to be really cold. So maybe if you can help offload to put this into this heater fund, that would be great. Um, and I think a lot of times, like, and I know some churches, they still want to kind of hold to that rule, but then there's some people who have these designated funds with tens of thousands of dollars in them for a specific person from somebody who is no longer alive. And yet, anytime when there's a business meeting and you're going, "Hey, can we use some of this money?" There's always someone who says, "Well, we can't touch this because this is designated for this." And it's like, well, you can. And plus, when people do go that avenue of using the money to go, it's like, okay, well, even though the person who gave this money is dead, let's go ahead and try to call their like siblings or their children are probably older, who are probably old themselves, or maybe a second cousin, someone who's related to the person saying, "Hey, can we do this?" It's like, if someone gave this money and they died, then guess what? You can use that money for whatever you want. If you want to dump it and you want to put it into your general budget, that's fine. If you want to use it for raises for your staff, go right ahead. But you don't need to just keep, because then what's good? Because again, if you're a church that's struggling financially, what are you going to do? Let your general budget just go bankrupt? But then at least we still had like $25,000 in one designated fund that probably could have helped us, but we chose not to because that was to get new nursery furniture.
Mhm.
So I think a lot of times, like when churches kind of say, "Oh, well, we have to be obedient or stay within these designated funds," like there's nothing biblical about that. And there's even nothing legal about that too. Yeah, if they're giving to the church, but at the same time, the church, once you give money to a church, the church has every ounce of power to be able to dictate how that money gets used.
Yeah, there was a situation a couple of years ago at a church I was working at where somebody donated, I don't know, like $75,000 as an honorarium to the worship department. And that money could only be used towards worship stuff like sound equipment, lighting. I don't know, but like every time we would go to make a request to use part of that gift or to use that gift, um, period, we had to go through like this approval process through the church and the person who donated the money. And it's like, well, you're really taking the idea of a gift away when you can't really use it towards anything except for what you say we can use it for.
Yeah.
Especially when you've donated it and designated it for that area of ministry. Um, and like, if I were, financially blessed enough to do so, like, and give 50 grand to student ministry of, you know, Bob's church down the road, like, I would be like, use it to advance the kingdom of God. And if that meant, hey, we're gonna pay for everybody's IYC this year, go for it. I don't care. Like, use it to advance God's kingdom. I'm not going to be the dictator in the response of how you should or should not use the money that was gifted to you. That's the whole point of what a gift is. It's like, Scott, I'm going to give you a gift. I'm going to give you one of the records you've been looking for, or like an NES cartridge you've been looking for. But what if I got you this one instead? That's not the one you want or the one you need. It's it's the one I'm going to get you, which makes no sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Um,
Go ahead.
no, I was gonna say, I think another saying that people say in the church that I think is not biblical is when people say, and has to do with like loved ones that passed on.
Hmm.
And let's say you're praying for healing for somebody, and someone says, well, they are healed. They just are healed in heaven now, which I almost have an issue with that because you're almost kind of communicating that healing only happens when we die. And yet we also kind of communicate that, well, God can't do any type of healing here on earth. Because then the challenge is let's say you have two people in your church, both are going through breast cancer. One's able to be in remission, is completely cured of cancer, and the other one's not and ends up passing away from breast cancer. And yet, within that congregation, you may have someone go, well, God healed this person. Well, why did they heal Mary Sue but not heal Beth over here? And I
But someone's
think,
like, you can't dictate what God will do or not do. You can pray.
yeah. And so, I mean, and I think a lot of times when it comes to like healing, especially when you're in churches that really communicate the idea of healing, um, and let's say no one gets healed, and they start to ask pastor so and so or church leader, hey, how come God didn't heal me? Usually, I would say probably 98% of the time, it is with the fault of the person who's going through the struggle, who's going through the battle. You didn't have enough faith. And yet, the thing is, when I read the scriptures, I think, probably one of my favorite stories in the Bible is the when Jesus healed the demon possessed boy who was having the epilepsy, and it was throwing it in the fire and the water, and the father's bringing it to Jesus, and the father says, well, if you can heal my son, let it be so. And Jesus says, if I can for those who believe. And the guy says, Lord, I believe, help my unbelief. That didn't mean that guy wasn't like had a full faith in Jesus. He still struggled. He's like, well, I'm going to trust you. I'm going to believe, but I still have some unbelief about this. And yet Jesus was able to heal that boy. Um, so I think a lot of times it has nothing to do, and I think faith is a part of it, but I would almost question, and is it's not necessarily this responsibility of the person who's asking for prayer. I think it's more the responsibility of faith of the person who's praying for the healing. So I think when someone makes that comment like, well, you didn't have enough faith, which I guess that's another thing why I didn't get healed. That's something that church says that's not biblical. Well, you didn't have enough faith. I think, well, it shouldn't be on the person. It's usually on the person. Plus, it was, Jesus praying for people, and if Jesus is the Son of God, but then even because the disciples trusted in Jesus and they were empowered by Jesus, they too were able to do the miracles as well. So I don't know. I think that's another thing too when it comes to like things with healing or sickness, how sometimes the church can say things and it either negates God's power because people can only be healed if they die, or only certain people can be healed and certain people cannot. And the basis of that is we just say, well, we put the blame on the person who needs the help, saying, well, you didn't have enough faith. And I think that's wrong on so many levels. And I don't think it's biblically or theologically accurate as well.
Yeah, it's like, where's your faith? That's kind of defeats the purpose of what faith is and what it means. And so,
Well, and I think even if
the
they're coming, and I think even if the person is coming and asking for prayer for healing, that takes a lot of faith to go up and say, hey, I'm struggling and I need prayer for this. Like, I mean, and that's like the mustard seed faith right there. And Jesus says mustard seed faith can move mountains. So the fact that someone's asking for prayer for healing, that's already that's already an instrumental amount of faith to ask to do someone to go up there and ask for healing or ask God to heal them. That takes faith just to make that decision and to make that leap and to make that call.
Yeah, it's definitely a um, conversation that people aren't willing to have, but they need to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Any other things that the church says or does that may not be biblical?
Um, there's a lot, but I can't think of any on the top of my head or off the top
No,
of my head.
you you can't have your kid in service because they're ruining the live stream.
Yes.
Because that's biblical. Jesus said, "Get these kids out of here. They're ruining my message. They're making too much noise."
Blessed are those who make noise.
Yeah, well, and then that's the thing, right? The disciples were trying to tell the kids not to go to Jesus, and what did Jesus do? Rebuke them. Jeez. And yet we have pastors going, "You're gonna ruin the live stream. You gotta have your kids in the nursery." Like, come on.
Get out of my sanctuary.
I mean, if that's an issue, then fire your sound guy because they didn't set up the sound thing right. You shouldn't be able to hear those babies crying if you mic'd everything correctly, or just turn off the house mic so then that way it's
Can't hear the
just the
child
pastor
screaming.
speaking. Come on, man. Jeez. Ugh. Yeah. So, friends, let us know. I know this is just a few. I know we had a lot of stuff to talk about today, but what are some things that you have heard within churches or your Christian areas where you've kind of felt like, hey, people are saying this, but I don't think it's biblical. We would love to know what you have to say. Feel free to put us in the comments, like especially Alicia and I forget who commented on our YouTube page. I think it was just a bunch of random names and numbers. But, always comment, put something on there. We'll read them on the air. And we kind of want to know your thoughts. So, again, you can email us at our website, thescott7.com, or you can comment on our YouTube page or anywhere you're finding this podcast. And we will be back on with another episode soon. Take care. Thank you for listening to the Scott Stedman Podcast. The Scott Stedman Podcast is made possible by support from our listeners. We thank listeners like Patty and Scott, whose support goes to this podcast's continual growth and maintenance. If you want to support this podcast, you can do so in a number of ways. First, feel free to give us a 5-star rating if you enjoyed this episode and share it with your friends. If you'd like to financially support the Scott Stedman Podcast, you can go to the website ko-fi.com/the Scott Stedman Podcast. That website again is ko-fi.com/the Scott Stedman Podcast. Thank you so much for listening.